Καλησπέρα σε όλους. Ευχαριστώ πολύ για την παρουσία σας και το χρόνο σας. This is to welcome all to IMS and the series of our lectures. We're very happy to have Veneta Ivanova, or is it Ivanova? Both are correct. Both are correct, okay. Veneta Ivanova. And it will be Professor Andreas Liberatos that will talk a little bit about you. We would like to thank you for being here. We'd like to have you also in the future here. So, Andreas, please.
So, thank you, Jelena. We have the pleasure to have with us today Dr. Ivanova, who is currently collaborating researcher at the Research Center for Modern History at Pantheon University. Veneta Ivanova has studied in Greece and the United States, and she has received her PhD from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 2017, and after that she was in 2018 Max Weber Fellow at the European University Institute at Florence, and she has also been visiting teacher at College William and Mary. Lately, she is one of the three editors of a very important book, which is called Rethinking the Balkans, Reimagining the Balkans, How to Think and Teach a Region, which is the first thrift for Maria Todorova, who was the mentor of Dr. Ivanova. So she's going to talk to us today about occult communism, culture, science, and spirituality in late socialist Bulgaria. This is a talk based mainly on her PhD research, which is, I think, under the process of being, the manuscript being published. So we are delighted to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrea, for the introduction, and I'd like to also extend my cordial thanks to the Institute for the Mediterranean Studies for this invitation. I'm delighted to be here. Oh. The title of my presentation, as already Andrea said, is Occult Communism, Culture, Science, and Spirituality in Socialist Bulgaria. When we think of late communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, we think stagnation, we think decay, we think dullness. Recently, a scholar based her entire book on the framework of the nothingness of the 1970s and 1980s. After all, there were no mass demonstrations or revolutions in the 1970s and 80s, nothing to match the high dramas of, say, the Prague Spring of 1968 or the revolutions of 1989. In communist Bulgaria, however, a curious phenomenon took shape in the 70s and 80s. Lyudmila Zhivkova, the eccentric daughter of long-term party leader Todor Zhivkov, led and revamped Bulgarian cultural politics and gave Bulgarian late communism a distinctly occult face. So the subject of my lecture today is what I term occult communism, which is a reference to the time period that Zhivkova assumed extraordinary powers over education, science, publishing, public television and radio, and international relations, and cast everything from the arts to culture, to science, even political philosophy, in the quite un-Marxist light of occultism. This is a picture of Zhivkova. So the big question is, how are we to explain such an incongruous lapse into state-sponsored spiritualism in a milieu dominated by materialism as a method, philosophy, and a way of life? So offering a glimpse into Zhivkova's aesthetico-spiritual utopia in both theory and praxis, this lecture will explore how the infusion of Bulgaria's cultural politics with Zhivkova's idiocratic occultism informed and transformed Bulgarian late communism. Though assessments of Zhivkova have ranged from eulogy to condemnation, they seem to agree at least on one point, that she was the most eccentric political figure in the Eastern Bloc. Historian of Eastern Europe, Richard Crampton, has depicted her as arguably the most extraordinary personality in the leading circles of any post-Stalinist state in Eastern Europe. Bulgarian intellectuals have lauded Zhivkova as the torchbearer of new thinking, permissiveness, pro-Western attitude. They have categorized her even as an anti-Marxist or even anti-communist. Western observers would give her high marks for her intelligence, drive, and organizational aptitude. And in a 1980 article titled emblematically, "Bulgaria submits to energetic guidance from a woman," the Times succinctly captured the source of Zhivkova's idiosyncrasy. Miss Zhivkova, a slim, intense woman with dark hair pulled back tightly over her head, is one of the more enigmatic personalities in Eastern Europe, combining the practical and theoretical in an unusual blend. On the practical side, she has opened up Bulgaria to outside culture, including much more from the West, and has revamped the education system. At the same time, she has thrown herself into the pursuit of the new socialist man, an abstract ideal that appears to combine Oriental mysticism, European philosophy, and Marxist doctrine in a mixture that even her admirers find puzzling. Initially drawn to a scholarly career, Zhivkova obtained a PhD in history at Sofia University, followed by specializations in Moscow and St. Anthony's College, Oxford. After the death of her mother, however, in 1971, she was propelled on the fast track to a dazzling political career. And so in a remarkably short period of time, she became a member of the Communist Party at the age of 25, Deputy Minister of Culture at 29, Minister of Culture at 33, a member of the Central Committee at 34, and a member of Politburo at 38. Due to a series of institutional maneuvers aiming to aid her meteoric rise through the ranks, at the tender age of 38, tender by communist standards, I mean, Zhivkova was a minister of a super ministry combining culture, art, education, and science, a full member of Politburo, and for practical purposes, the second most powerful person after her father, Todor Zhivkov, who this is her father on the right, and that's her second husband, and her daughter and her son. In parallel with her blooming scholarly and political careers, Zhivkova also started arranging weekly Friday soirees at her apartment, a buzz with the cream of Sofia's intellectual life, writers, poets, historians, archaeologists, journalists, actors, etc. And most of the attendees of this, as they were known, Milas Fridays, were quickly catapulted to prestigious positions, to prestigious executive appointments in the administration of art, culture, and education. Zhivkova's rapid advancement, as we saw, in the state and party hierarchy was forced to an abrupt halt by a car accident she sustained in 1973 when she was supposed to go see her father off on a state visit to Poland. So this near fatal accident constituted a watershed not only in her personal story, worldview, way of living, and public persona, but also how she perceived her role in Bulgarian politics and also in world politics. And it was during the recuperation from this accident that she started adopting the belief systems, tenets, and rules of this occult mystical, interwar occult mystical movement known as the Agni Yoga or living ethic. I will just open a parenthesis here. That this Agni Yoga is a religio-philosophical teaching that was transmitted by Nicholas and Helena Röhrig, the two underneath, in the 1920s. And this teaching was an offshoot of Theosophy, which is Helena Blavatskaya here, the founder of Theosophy. And the important thing just to keep in mind is that this teaching combines different aspects: philosophy, cosmogony, ethics, religion, and the practical guide to living all together. So, like I said, Zhivkova barely survived the accident, and afterwards she engaged in procedures of healing, self-healing via Indian and Tibetan teachings. Zhivkova's second husband here on the picture, Ivan Slavkov, who was the director of the Bulgarian national television, sort of a self-styled bon vivant and actually quite a prodigious philanderer, I might add. But anyway, he reported that it was right after the car accident that, I'm quoting, she engaged in studies of the functioning of the brain, of the harmoniously developed personality, of these teachings about meditation, in essence about the breaking from the material and embracing the spiritual. So she developed a whole cluster of new interests in philosophy, philosophical systems of India, yogism, comparative world religions, history of the art, so on and so forth. So the thing to bear in mind is that by now Zhivkova is by no means a theoretician of Marxism-Leninism. Her real interest lay in occultism. And more importantly, what I want to show today is that she manipulated official and unofficial levers to translate her religio-philosophical beliefs into state policy. Emboldened by her secure position in the state and party apparatus, her access to unlimited state resources, but also the international climate of detente, she began in the mid-70s to propagate her unorthodox views on the centrality of spirituality, art, and culture in perfecting society, the individual, even international relations. And her ultimate goal was to sort of breed a nation of all-round and harmoniously developed individuals devoted to spiritual self-perfection, who would ultimately, quote unquote, work, live, and create according to the laws of beauty. So now I'll start reconstructing her theory, and I'll start, because it's important how afterwards she implements it in policy, and I'll start reconstructing her cultural theory from her very understanding of the concept of culture. Deviating from any standard Marxist-Leninist definitions, Zhivkova impressed in her speeches the need to understand culture in a much broader sense as the aspiration towards light, development, progress, evolution, towards elevation of consciousness to a higher and higher stage of existence. During the meetings of the Presidium of the Committee of Culture, she frequently urges her associates to understand culture as one comprehensive concept which incorporates the quote-unquote evolution of the whole universe and of natural phenomena, together with the all-round development of the human being, as well as the manifestation of the eternal essence that is inherent in man and is constantly in the process of evolving. So basically, since culture is the main factor in the formation and development of the individual, society, nation, the universe, it penetrates all spheres of life. Similarly, aesthetics does not pertain simply to the realms of the arts in general and to the faculties of art appreciation in particular. In her understanding, aesthetics is the science of the development of the senses, which are the organs of consciousness. Aesthetics is the expansion of one's consciousness via perfecting the senses and organs that could help one perceive the beautiful in life, so that through continuous self-perfection, one can become creator himself. So the goal of aesthetics is twofold. First, to transform one into an all-round and harmoniously developed personality. And second, because aesthetics is at the same time to lead to the perfection of the individual, society, and humanity, it is also inherently ethical in nature. This is why Zhivkova sees the problem of the moral ethical foundation as one of the most fundamental principles of aesthetics. So ethics and aesthetics are intertwined, as everything in the individual must be beautiful: morality, feelings, thoughts, actions, and aspirations. Now, this concept, moral ethical edification, for Zhivkova had openly religious connotations. Spirituality, which she conceived as the spiritual development of the individual and the renewal of the spiritual powers and energies of the nation. So spirituality was the cornerstone of her cultural politics. So preponderant is spirituality that, in a complete reversal of materialism, for Zhivkova, it is consciousness that determines life and the spiritual that determines the material. She's asking, how can you doubt that when we talk about awakening of man's spiritual and creative forces and about elevating the levels of his mental activity, this is not going to reflect on his biology and physiology? As central as spirituality was for her, it was not opposed to science. On the contrary, Zhivkova's vision of Bulgaria's education called for the synthesis of spirituality and science, insisting on the interconnections between the mutually conditioned interdependence between man as a microcosm and nature and the universe as of a microcosm. So basically, she was insisting that she invoked the new vistas opening up in front of modern science and called for the need to integrate the sciences and to study the interdisciplinary connections between, for example, cosmobiology, biochemistry, astrobiology, and astrophysics. And in any case, all these overtures in cosmology, philosophy, and science lead us to the essence of Zhivkova's cultural and educational theory, namely that culture and art can no longer be perceived as separate spheres, but must be integrated together with science, religion, and education in order to realize Zhivkova's pet project, of which she became an adamant proponent throughout her life, that of aesthetic education. So this philosophy basically was the driving force behind all the programs that Zhivkova implemented via the Ministry of Culture, such as the long-term national program for aesthetic education, the national program for the harmonious development of man, and the International Children's Assembly Banner of Peace under the patronage of UNESCO. So afterwards, she started having even global aspirations going on the international scene. So these are the programs that I'm going to talk about in this talk to show how they were implemented in practice. So the National Program for Aesthetic Education was adopted at the 10th Congress of the Communist Party in 1971, which posed the question for the all-round and harmonious development of the individual as the most fundamental social problem. I'm quoting from the program: to the brute aggression of technology, pollution, and the destruction of the spiritual essence of man, the Bulgarian Communist Party was to counterpose the leading role of culture and spirituality. And the program was launched immediately afterwards, like a few months later, when the Council of Ministers decreed the establishment of an experimental boarding school from 1st through 11th grade with a nursery and kindergarten attached to it in Gorna Banja on the outskirts of Sofia. So this national experimental school was envisioned as a major national methodological training center and a big spiritual laboratory, which would integrate all the sciences: biology, chemistry, physics, physiology, astronomy, pedagogy, philosophy, psychology, all the arts and all forms of aesthetic education. The idea was that, unlike traditional art schools in Bulgaria, this modern experimental center would not prepare specialists in different types or realms of art, but would experiment with the uses of art in general for the forming and perfection of the individual. So this experimental school offered instruction in all the standard disciplines, but the arts played a pivotal role, as students were expected to unfold all their talents and cultivate aesthetic sensitivities and tastes. In addition to all the arts being added to the standard curriculum, students were to develop all their senses and motor functions, to communicate with nature, to learn foreign languages, and as they progress to more advanced classes, to develop their analytical, systematizing, and creative thinking. So students at the experimental school attended classes from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. And until noon, they covered the standard national curriculum that was prescribed by the Ministry of Education. And then they had like a noon break. And after the lunch and noon break, students engaged in artistic education: music, ballet, drawing classes, languages, Russian, English, French. So this experimental school was the first building block of a national educational cultural complex, which would, as I said, integrate education, the sciences, the artistic, cultural, and the spiritual spheres. The second link in this complex was the launching of the National Gymnasium for Ancient Languages and Cultures, NGEDEC in Bulgarian for shorter, which aimed to train specialists in Latin, Ancient Greeks, Old Bulgarian, Sanskrit, etc., languages and cultures. However, this gymnasium would not prepare just specialists, say, in Iranian, ancient Greek, Byzantine, or Indian civilizations. Rather, the emphasis was on the comparative and interdisciplinary study of these cultures. So Živkova essentially aimed via NGEDEC to establish Bulgaria, in her words, as a big cultural and spiritual center that will try again to establish the contact between Eastern and Western cultures. And to complete the educational cultural complex, a third link was created: an integral scientific center for all the exact sciences, all the exact and natural sciences, which would serve as a laboratory for integrating all the scientific disciplines, including the humanities, and whose objects of inquiry would be such things as the problems of outer space, nature, the human being, and human society. So these three educational clusters, once established, would be connected in an open system, wherein specialists and students from one center could work at another. They would teach, and at the same time, they would educate themselves. And Živkova saw these three centers as future methodological centers for the preparation of individuals who will carry the seeds of holistic development, elevated consciousness, and the new attitude towards life, and who will in turn spread these virtues among a larger circle of people, and eventually would transmit to the entire nation. This new type of integral education Živkova advocated would ensure that the new persons of the future will be, I'm quoting, will be people who can write music, sing, play, ballet, draw, because art is synthetic, it is integral, in her words. The architect of the future, for example, will not be just an architect, he will be a creator who will have the integral knowledge of a sculptor, engineer, and poet, and above all, a person with preserved aesthetics and spirituality. And the term Živkova employed for this new society of the future was integral, or synthesized communism. So now I'm going to move to an even more ambitious program. In parallel with the founding of the experimental school in Engedek, another more daring initiative was launched in 1978 to realize this national goal of aesthetic education. The complex program for the harmonious development of the individual, sorry for these long titles, I'm already hurting just pronouncing it. The program was to be implemented in stages in the course of 15-20 years. And each stage would last a year and would have its patron, a bright spiritual representative of all humankind. And in order to qualify as a patron, the selected personality had to be an all-round and harmoniously developed individual, had to be a propeller of important historical processes in the evolution of humankind, and the proponent of timeless universal values. And taken as a whole, the list had to be geographically and chronologically diverse, so as to enable the program to treat not just the person himself, but the entire historical epoch. And the list of patrons was eclectic, started with Nicholas Roerich that I showed you. There were arguments because the Communist Party didn't want to start with him. They wanted to start with Lenin, but she insisted. So the first stage was Nicholas Roerich. And then Leonardo da Vinci, Lenin, Goethe, Saint Constantine Kirill, the philosopher, Avicenna, so on and so forth. They were, I think, maybe 9 years that were actually implemented, and after her death, the program was sort of discontinued. So each stage was intended to gradually build the long-term program as a unified organism by deepening, making concrete, and summarizing the results accomplished in the preceding stage. And to Zhivkova, Roerich, Da Vinci, Einstein, Lomonosov, Eftimiev, Turnovo, these were not simply representatives of their time period, but enlightening figures who appeared at certain stages of the evolutionary process of humankind to give the perspectives and guidance for the future, not for the present. And so these universal personalities, as she called them, and she really insisted that they be universal, moved the evolution of humankind forward and revealed the potentialities of man and the meaning of human existence. During each annual stage, a multiplicity, really crazy multiplicity of nationwide and international events took place. Exhibitions, lectures, seminars, public readings, festivals, conferences, and all these were meant to acquaint the Bulgarian public with the selected polymath's achievements in all areas of his work. This was intended to unleash, according to her, a spontaneous grassroots movement for aesthetic education, encompassing all the segments of the population, but especially youth, and to instill a new attitude towards the arts. It was also meant to stimulate the production of syncretic, cultural, scientific, and artistic works of a radically new kind. As Zhivkova put it, the goal is not just to show the essence of Roerich's or Leonardo's or Alberti's all-round and harmonious development. The goal is for us as their followers to be like them, for us to develop the same faculties, to be part of the same processes. The ultimate goal is this to be the ideal and aspiration of the contemporary Bulgarian. So, like I said, the first stage was Nicholas Roerich, it was inaugurated with him, who is a Russian occultist, a painter, poet, thinker, explorer, philosopher, and fighter for peace. The second one was Leonardo da Vinci. This was actually the most successful, I think, because da Vinci obviously is very well known, but the angles that she took, and also the exhibition that was organized in Bulgaria as a culmination, you know, with like copies of his original works, a copy of the Mona Lisa from 1520. It was like it generated huge enthusiasm and interest. And then the culmination of all these programs, she decided, like I said, to take it internationally, was the the Banner of Peace International Assembly, which took place in 1979. So from 15th to 25th of August 1979, the world's first International Children's Assembly Banner of Peace took place in Sofia, Bulgaria, under the patronage of UNESCO's General Director. And at the time, this was the grandest international initiative worldwide to celebrate the UNESCO proclaimed International Year of the Child, where more than 2,500 children from 77 countries congregated in Sofia to partake of an opulently staged global festival of children's art, music, and literature. In front of the bursting audience, including the multi-ethnic young artist creators, the political and cultural elite of socialist Bulgaria, and the international dignitaries from the Assembly's organizing committee, Zhivkova delivered her opening speech. Oh, here, this is Zhivkova. This is exactly actually right on during the Banner of Peace Assembly, when this is the son of Nicholas Riorik, Sviatoslav Riorik, with his, who is also an architect and a painter and an occultist, and his movie star Indian wife, Devika Rani. So, dear children, citizens of our planet, may the calling power of beauty, truth, and wisdom join your hearts in the name of cooperation and the common future of mankind. May the fiery breath of life always ennoble your thoughts and aspirations. May art be pure and bright. May consciousness envelope the limits of the cosmos. The blessed paths of art will unlock in front of you the doors of new unknown worlds. Thousands of blazing stars will unveil their secrets. There will glow the vibration of electrons, filling the vast expanse of iridescent spheres with their harmony and rhythm. The art to create and to perfect, to cut out the crystals of the new, and with an open spirit to welcome the effulgent purposefulness. This is the path of the artist, illuminating the steps of evolution. Now, it is not clear what the addressees of this quite unorthodox speech, which were children of up to 14 years of age, made of phrases such as effulgent purposefulness, vibration of the electrons, consciousness, iridescent spheres. In fact, it is not clear what anyone not initiated into her belief system thought. But what is clear is that the entire 15-minute speech was focused on the centrality of art and culture to the betterment of the individual, society, and humanity, and it was thoroughly deprived of any reference to Marxist-Leninist ideology or any kind of language. So in retrospect, this speech could be viewed as the public apotheosis of her religio-philosophical system. And the Banner of Peace Assembly itself was the culmination of Zhivkova's late socialist, what I call large-scale endeavor to translate her religio-philosophical worldview into state policy. The Banner of Peace Assembly was a complex initiative with myriad events that started at the local level. It started from the year before. It started at the local level, expanded regionally, continuously broadening the scope on the principle, she called it, on the principle of the rolling snowball to reach the national level and culminate with the International Children's Assembly Banner of Peace. And all these myriad initiatives at the local, regional, national, and international level coalesced under the motto Unity, Creativity, Beauty. I'm not going to go over it because it is massive, but the centerpiece was the international exhibition of children's art that was called Unity, Creativity, Beauty, which exhibited 6,000 works sent to the assembly by children who wished to participate from all four corners of the world. And the collected works of art by children were subsequently cataloged, archived, and stored. And the most impressive masterpieces were selected to be displayed to a world audience through a number of publications, reproductions, photo albums, and also high-level visits, like Zhivkova, for example, going to the UN and taking the exhibition with her. And like I said, it included also festival in composition, in music, in photography, etc. Now, Zhivkova's policies, all these extravagant policies, were received with ambivalence by the public at the time. On the one hand, the emphasis on Bulgaria's ancient cultural heritage and its contributions to European and world culture struck a responsive chord with a nationalism already on the rise since the 1960s. And national sentiments among the populace, but especially among the intelligentsia, escalated in the 1970s. In addition, the intelligentsia cherished Zhivkova's unprecedentedly, historically speaking, lavish sponsorship of the arts and culture, also the relaxation, permissiveness, of the cultural sphere. And also, most importantly, the cultural exchanges with the West. The fact that Bulgarian cultural policy was formulated by intellectuals and experts at the Committee of Culture and not by party organs or members paid intellectuals and artists quite some handsome dividends. On the other hand, many resented Zhivkova for her nepotistic rise to the summits of power, for her costly initiatives, and for her esoteric peregrinations that were seen anywhere on a scale from incomprehensible to mystical to messianic frenzies, etc. Todor Zhivkov himself, who was a lot more pragmatic and was actually focused more on economic development and technological modernization, not always comprehended Zhivkova's initiatives. Actually, he disagreed with some of them. But they served him well, I will explain. So how was it possible for Zhivkova to initiate her large-scale occult-inspired undertakings? And like I said, even though Zhivkov not always approved of his daughter's ideas, her cultural politics dovetailed well with the political imperative of the regime. For many from Zhivkova's generation who did not have any direct experience of the pre-1945 period, the ideas of Marxism had lost their allure. While the language of Marxism-Leninism was still deployed in official documents or in party congresses, it was quite emptied of content. And what came to fill the ideological void for youth was obviously Western-style consumerism and the acquisition of consumer goods. By the 1960s, consumption had become a major symbolic battleground on which the political and ideological clash of capitalism and communism was fought. But by the 70s, it became clear that the promised consumer socialism did not satisfy the need of Bulgarians as much as Western consumer goods did. So in this context, when the term communism vanished altogether, substituted by a humbler, mature socialism, or even by the less aspirational, developed socialist society, Zhivkova's sincere emphasis on spirituality, aesthetics, and consumption of culture as opposed of commodities proved a convenient shield against unfavorable comparisons. So it was in a way politically expedient. In addition, Zhivkova's relentless promotion of cultural and artistic artifacts in Western Europe, in the US, in Canada, in the Balkan capitalist states were seen as healthily promoting Bulgaria's self-esteem and international reputation, which was quite notorious as Bulgaria was referred to as to the 16th Republic, being perceived as the Soviet Union's most pliant satellite. Finally, Lyudmila Zhivkova's positions among the intelligentsia allowed Todor Zhivkov to establish a close symbiosis in Bulgaria between the party and the intelligentsia, which did not exist in many of the other East European states. In Bulgarian historiography, this is known as Todor Živkov's flirt with the intelligentsia, which in practical terms meant that if intellectuals kept the rules of the game and did not criticize the regime openly, they were allowed creative freedom and they had a lot of permissiveness in the artistic and cultural sphere. So to sum up some of the points I made, from the spiritual definition of culture as the reverence of light to culture as synthesis of science, art, philosophy, and religion to all-round development, Živkova spoke and wrote the language of modern occultism. While Živkova's worldview is genealogically traceable to Nikolai and Helena Röhrich's teaching, she was not just a follower. Rather, she saw her biggest contribution in finding novel and original forms to adapt Agni Yoga to the late socialist socio-political and cultural realities. So in a way, I offered a glimpse into Živkova's worldview, arguing that Živkova's religiosity both permeated her theoretical apparatus and defined the priorities of Bulgaria's cultural policy. Since every single initiative, project, and program in the cultural or artistic realm was both derived from her worldview and imbued with occult meanings, symbols, and goals, Živkova's religio-philosophical worldview cannot be decoupled from the assessment of her cultural politics. And now I will end the lecture with the broader implications of my work. So essentially, I argue that in her cultural politics, Lyudmila Živkova sought to reimagine late socialism and practiced a radical aesthetic utopianism imbued with the fanatical optimism that art, culture, and spirituality would illuminate the way toward what she called synthesized or integrated communism. The wholesale revamping of Bulgarian education, culture, and art, the long-term national programs for aesthetic education and harmonious development, the experimental school for talented children, the banner of peace assembly were all concrete expressions of this utopian impulse. And many of her projects were exceedingly ambitious and extravagant. But as quixotic as Živkova's aesthetic utopianism was, during her tenure, cultural policy was generated, debated, formulated, and implemented by intellectuals, artists, and experts, and not by party organs. While it was occultism and not Marxism that provided Živkova with the framework to link ontology, aesthetics, and utopia, her esotericism was not antithetical to communism. Rather than viewing her occult cultural politics as incompatible with communism, or in the exaggerated assessments of her associates as anti-Soviet or even anti-communist, I situate her religio-spiritual utopia as an attempt to ennoble the communist project via occultism. Her occult communism is ultimately a manifestation of the pursuit of the ideal of the new socialist man, even if socialist was subsumed under the new man of esotericism. And now, of course, the attempt to revamp communism via esotericism is not a phenomenon that's specific to late socialist Bulgaria. For example, from the very birth of state socialism, for example, in the 1920s, Soviet Russia saw a proliferation of all sorts of occult-inspired social experiments, alternative communes, informal clubs, etc. Like the early short-lived Soviet utopias, Živkova's attempt to inject Bulgarian communism with occultism was a social engineering project aiming at creating a community of well-rounded individuals who would live in harmony, perfecting their minds and body and so on. But at the same time, Živkova's spiritual utopian politics was distinctive. Given her role as Zhivkova's daughter, as a Politburo member, and as a hyperactive minister of a super ministry, she had virtually unlimited resources and venues at her disposal to attempt to realize her vision at the national level. And although Zhivkova's ideas often verged on the chimerical, her aesthetic utopianism ultimately demonstrates that, contrary to common assertion, attempts to attach a human face to the communist project continued even after the Prague Spring of 1968. So rather than seeing late socialism as an era of normalization and nothingness, the Bulgarian case study reveals that late socialist society was culturally, intellectually, spiritually, and artistically dynamic in Bulgaria. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful talk. I think we can pass on to the discussion, and the word is yours for questions, comments.
Thank you very much. This was delightful, actually, and very not informative, but also inspirational in many ways. The first question is whether you have found out that she imitated somebody from what she was writing, or where did she derive all this? I mean, you mentioned that, but I mean, the whole sort of yeah.
These are her.
Oh, the mentors.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So probably, yeah, you didn't have time to say more of that. So it's like theosophy, you said. The other thing that I want to ask, this aesthetic education, why aesthetic? And the last very easy question, how did she die? And if anything, if that school that she founded continued.
Okay, I couldn't avoid the death question. Like I said, some of her inspirations are most importantly Rerich. But on the Bulgarian side, there was this Bogumil Rainov, who was an aesthetician, writer of spy novels. He was also the major censor in Bulgaria, very erudite, part of the pre-socialist elite. And his father is also very famous. So his father is Nikolai Rainov, very famous Bulgarian painter, also sort of a polymath, who was the one who introduced occultism and theosophy to Bulgaria. So Bogumil Rainov inherited his father's library, and he translated these teachings into Bulgarian, and he was the one who introduced Zhivkova to them. Aesthetic, I already talked about her emphasis on aesthetics and her understanding of aesthetics. So aesthetics, it's aesthetic education, but not what we mean by that. She had her own understanding of what that meant. And on the death, yeah, so Zhivkova died in 1981 at the peak of her popularity and at the prime of her energies. She was 39 years old. So anyways, right after the end of socialism, there was an explosion of memoirs about Zhivkova by all her associates who worked with her, including her bodyguard wrote one. And mostly the focus is on her death because it further contributed towards the mythologization of Zhivkova, and it created all sorts of conspiracy theories. She was found to get back to the question, she was in her villa. She was found dead by the maid in the bathtub. And the official version, the official version is that she had cerebral hemorrhage and she slipped in the bathtub and she died. But through these memoirs that I'm telling you about, I mean, all sorts of stories were created. So basically there are 4 versions. The first version is the official version, that she died due to illness. The second version was that she was, let's say, sleeping pills induced, you know, she was, one of the versions is that she was killed actually by the KGB, obviously, because of her supposedly anti-Soviet, let's say, ideas. And another variation of this hypothesis is that she was, let's say, killed by her Bulgarian opponents. And there is the version that she committed suicide. Now, personally, I think that, I mean, she was ascetic, she was barely eating, she was vegetarian, she was drinking green tea all day, she was extremely hyperactive, super workaholic. And what happened was quite a few of her associates were engaged in embezzlement because she was very naive. Everyone was going there. We're talking here, of course, about huge sponsorship of everything that had to do with any of her interests. And then there were a number of they were handed even jail sentences because, and so right before she died, she went to the villa and had a fight with Todor Zhivkov, who was telling her and showing her the evidence that those close associates of hers were actually embezzling funds, and there was evidence. So it was this disappointment because she took it like she was so devoted herself, and being naive, she thought everyone was encouraged, you know, didn't have any ulterior motives and stuff like that. So the disappointment, the fact that what she said, I feel like I've been building on sand foundations, and her extreme tempo of work and physical deprivation, I think in the end, just her energies were exhausted. But also she had the car accident, so. Yes?
When I hear about supernatural in Bulgaria, the first thing it comes to my mind is Baba Vanga. And in Greece, in recent years, especially the years of the economic crisis, and until now, I think, we have a renewal of the belief of Baba Vanga's prophecies among the prophecies of Paisios here in Greece. So for years, I had the question, what was the policy, the attitude of the government and the Communist Party of Bulgaria towards Vanga and her beliefs, and the spreading or the survival of her beliefs in the Bulgarian population, especially rural population, the last 2 decades, 70s, 80s, and...
Okay, so just to clarify...
New Vanga, or I don't know.
Just to clarify for those of you who don't know who Baba Vanga is, so this is this blind seeress or prophetess in Bulgaria who she was especially close with Lyudmila Zhivkova. She was, let's say, I mean, all the intellectuals, politicians, foreign dignitaries who are coming to Bulgaria were visiting Vanga. And on the question of the state, actually, and I have an entire chapter on that, it was at some point Vanga's practice of prophesying was institutionalized and nationalized by the state. So the state organized her practice. And there was an entire institute of suggestology where Vanga was actually the object and subject of suggestology, so from suggestion, So this Institute of Suggestology was, you know, examining Vanga's prophetic skills. It was experimenting with telepathy and all this kind of stuff. So the state was very much involved. It was, like I said, every foreign political delegation that was coming to Sofia was taken, or Vanga was, a car was sent to bring her from Petric to bring her to Sofia, or they were going to Petric. And at some point, because so many people wanted to go to her, the state stepped in and institutionalized the practice. They were like, you had to sort of enroll in these long lists and wait for months before you would be able to have a consultation with Vanga. And her, what you're saying, there is continuity. She was, it was quite interesting because intellectuals via Vanga subsequently claimed sort of dissident status, or the fact that they were, you know, they wanted to show that they were, but the cult, let's say, following of Vanga was very much alive during socialism. It was, and it had, to this day, it's quite popular, yeah. But there is a big archive of all the queries and all the questionnaires that were done with the attendees to Vangas, and everything is like systematized in a database and examined and stuff like that.
Yes, you didn't answer about the school that you made. What
Yes.
happened to the school?
Okay, so in terms of her legacy, right? So in terms of her legacy, the programs were discontinued shortly after her death. For example, the banner of Peace Assembly continued several years. It was revived afterwards by her daughter. The program for harmonious development of man also, after her, they were maybe like 3-4 more years, but in the context of the Second Cold War, these were strictly political, like it was Engels and Marx. I mean, those were the, so of the long lasting, so what I meant to say is that few of the programs survived her death. And even fewer survived the end of communism. However, Engedek and the National School for Talented Children, as well as the monumental legacy, for example, I have here the National Palace of Culture. That was, you know, her idea of National Palace of Culture, which to this day is one of the major congress and concert centers in Bulgaria. That's what, so the material legacies, the monuments that were created for the assembly, the National Gallery for Foreign Art, the National History Museum, the materials legacy stayed. Now the Experimental School for Talented Children and Engedek are two of the best schools. They continue to be. The first one now is transformed to Italian Lyceum, and Engedek is still Engedek, and they continue to produce very high quality education. So those are some of the legacies that survived communism. Because right after her death, like I said, in the context of the Second Cold War, culture started following the political imperative. Lots of her close associates were fired from their positions. I don't mean just the ones who embezzled, who obviously they had jail sentences, but all the other ones, Bogumil Rainov, Alexander Fall, like they were sort of sidelined. But yeah, in terms of legacy, the monuments and the institutions that she built, that's the legacy that I can think of that's important. But all these grand programs, they were discontinued shortly after her death, within 5 years.
Thank you very much for your presentation. not only question for you, but it's a broader discussion, because the occultism was very popular in all the countries of Soviet Union, and especially in the Slavic part, of course. And the question it is why? Because why it was so popular, of course, or not in an official way, like in case of Bulgaria, but why it was so popular? Because of atheism, because of the roots that they are coming from the past, because of the regime. It's a broader topic. I don't know if there is some researchers on that, but I think it's very interesting to think it in a comparison with other countries of the Soviet Union.
No, you're absolutely right, and this is what I do actually in my book. I do a comparative because, like you said, in the Soviet Union, in Czechoslovakia, in Yugoslavia, it was very popular. For example, in the Soviet Union, it was, let's say, acculturated to science as bioelectronics. In Bulgaria, it was suggestology, telekinesis, whatever. All this, you're absolutely right, it was popular. But what I want to amend is that it was popular not only just in the East, and not only when you're talking about atheism, yes, it coincides, for example, with the fact that in the 60s, you have amelioration of atheist propaganda everywhere. Some of the excesses of like the initial atheist drive were removed, with the exception of Romania. But you have also in the West attempts to have sort of political theologies to merge, let's say, like after the Second Vatican Council, and to merge, let's say, Catholicism with Marxism or Protestantism and stuff like that. And it was, like I said, and in one of the chapters I talk about this exactly, because I mean, it's also contemporaneous with the New Age movement in the West, right? So you have all this like occult mystical movements, genuine curiosity about the paranormal among not only the governments but the populace, hugely popular. Like think of the Manchurian Candidate, or like so there was genuine curiosity at the time in the 60s and 70s, was some kind of a crisis of, I don't know, rationalism. I mean, there's various explanations, but yeah, it was. But what I wanted to say, that the Bulgarian case, the difference is that the level of institutionalization, right? Because in Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, you have like, let's say, certain centers that include leading scientists, mathematicians, physicists, chemists, what have you. But they are not like Bulgaria being a small country, and also because of the conjuncture with Zhivkova being having so much power, and the level of institutionalization, that it was openly, everyone knew that this is bankrolled by the state, and this is like a state, like the founder of the Institute of Suggestology, the psychiatrist Georgi Lozanov, was with huge protections. Like he could do whatever he wanted. He exported his inventions to the West. And Westerners, Canadians, for example, were coming to the Institute of Suggestology to adopt this method that he patented, Suggestopedia, so that they could convert their public service to bilingualism, because it was linked. He used this method to learn foreign languages fast, right? So, I mean, actually, not only was it supported by the state, but it was exported. It was a very successful export as well, because in the West in particular, they went crazy over it.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Reading the text that she pronounced in the panel of youth.
Yeah.
One would expect that there were people out there who could understand.
Yeah.
The force of Blavatsky or the Russian grammar. I guess it was a white Russian.
Well, no, he was a red Russian, let's put it this way. Yeah, quite red. Yeah.
His son understood, yes, and in the West as well.
Yeah.
I mean, Blavatsky was also
Of course.
popular in the Nazi Germany. So, two people that understood their message, that made themselves known. You have answers, and people out of the blue say, was this simply a personal adventure of a talented daughter of a leader of a country, or was it something more, or did she find an echo elsewhere? Europe, America,
So I kind of hinted at it, but didn't have time to develop. The idea was that, like I said, she started, I mean, she was very close with all the intellectuals. So they had these circles where all of them were familiar with these readings and, you know, the texts and the art and all that kind of stuff. And many of them, actually, some of her closest ones were genuine believers also in this, like Svetlin Rusev, a very famous painter. But others didn't understand and they didn't care, because talking strictly about the intellectuals, they're like, we don't care if she wants to talk about resplendent spheres, whatever. The reality is that we can do what we want, and it's unprecedented historically that so much sponsorship goes to art education, anything. Like, there were no banned books. She personally would intervene, for example, for banned books of dissidents, you know. So even if they didn't understand, they kind of went along with it because it was convenient. It was, but of course, there were people who found it utterly incomprehensible. And even like in the one of the diaries of this literary critic, after the speech, he wrote it down in his diary saying, like, this is a jewel of Bulgarian language. It should be carved out in marble and placed as a monument in front of the Committee of Culture to testify to to this. But no, I mean, her idea, what I wanted to say is that the idea of all these occult movements is that you initiate. So all these people are initiated, first the intellectuals, and she says it openly when she's talking to her close circle of friends, that this is the idea. This is sort of an enlightenment thing, like first the intellectuals and then more and more people, youth. So this is why the emphasis is on youth, so that they can start from a very, very early age. And the idea is that ultimately the entire nation, even though now it's not prepared, the seeds need to be planted. This is how she was thinking about it. And she couldn't care less, because she was saying, I know that there are assessments of me, that I'm schizophrenic and that I'm crazy, but she couldn't care less.
no, speaking about people from Bulgaria around the world.
Oh, yeah.
Whatever.
No, but they just thought it was, they didn't understand, because you have to be part of these circles and to be reading this kind of literature. But they thought that, well, she didn't speak like all the others in boring Marxist-Leninist language. So they thought that it was something very Western. So she was perceived as very Western. And what they understood, I mean, they understood her concrete policies, because she was relentlessly propagating everywhere exhibitions, huge number of like first-rate exhibitions of Thracian art, medieval icons. Like, she was, so they understood the concrete expressions, the policy embodiments they understood. Now, the language, bear in mind, she was not speaking like that. Like the stuff that I've reconstructed her worldview from the personal file, because those speeches were purged. They are purged from the archive. And also she had two advisors that were specifically responsible for, you know, cutting down this language and putting a veneer of Marxism, Leninism in her speeches so that people can relate to her. But those speeches that I reconstruct her worldview from, she gave them when she felt very comfortable in the presidium of the Committee of Culture, which all of them were her, like they were initiated in that, and they were very close. So there she could take the liberty to give all these occultist treatments and analysis of the Mona Lisa, of what have you, of specific works of art. But this was not for the public. I mean, this is why I meant that the Banner of Peace was the first time that she spoke like so. Sorry, I couldn't hear for what? Yeah. I have my doubts that she knew anything about nuclear energy, and she certainly didn't talk about it or refer to it. As far as engineering and science, I cannot really tell, but I know that scientists were very well taken care of. Whatever science, insofar as it was innovative and it was you know, she had an ear. The same was with her father, Todor Zhivkov, as well, because he was actually interested in technology and science more than her. So any person who came up with some invention would go and, I mean, they were very much encouraged, permitted to do their work, but because this is not my area, I cannot really tell you strictly about engineering. But the idea was that all the leading scientists in Bulgaria were involved in the building of these monumental monuments, buildings, on a really massive scale. So you had the engineers, architects, everyone was working like really the best, because the idea was to synthesize science with art. And but I have to look up the nuclear energy. I really don't know.
May I ask you a couple of questions also? The first one is, what was the attitude of Zhivkova and her circle towards the teaching of Peter Dunov and the White Brotherhood, which we know that had a lot. What? Yeah. What was the attitude of Zhivkova and her circle towards the teaching of Peter Dunov and the White Brotherhood, that we know that had a lot of following in Bulgaria from the interwar period onwards? And this question leads me to unite my remarks with those of many of the other people that ask you questions. I think what is very interesting are the repercussions and the receptions of her, let's say, message, her plans. So the first question, of course, is how did Soviet Union look at what she was doing, or let's say orthodox Marxist circles, and if there were reactions against her. But the most important question is how the Bulgarian people actually perceived what she was doing. And in this sense, I would like to ask you about your methodology. Have you used oral history in your research? Or is there any chance that we could probably reconstruct the way that the Bulgarians, having this tradition also of occultism to a certain extent at a popular level, reacted to her own message?
Mm-hmm.
And the last question is, of course, how do you think that this research can go on in a comparative plan, probably, or what are your thoughts for the future?
Wait, because you gave me work here now for half an hour. So on the reception, well, the Soviet Union wasn't quite happy, of course, with her policies, especially there is another grand initiative that I didn't cover in this talk, which is 1,300 years of Bulgaria. This was this initiative to celebrate 13 centuries of the first Bulgarian state that was celebrated worldwide, and this was also a very massive project. And the Soviets were obviously accusing Zhivkova of nationalism, that this is nationalism, and Todor Zhivkov had to go on a few occasions to Moscow to sort of defend her policies, which he did, including one of the criticisms was about her very tight connections with the White Brotherhood. But Todor Zhivkov himself had connections with the White Brotherhood, because when he was in the underground during the Second World War, they were hiding in the this is the White Brotherhood. This is this occult mystical interwar movement created by Petar Danov, whose father was an Orthodox priest, and then he was educated in the US by the Protestants. And then when he came back to Bulgaria, everybody wanted him. The Orthodox Church wanted him, Protestants, Catholics. However, he decided to found his own movement, which became very popular, and it is he was familiar with all the esoteric currents in the US. He knew Theosophy, Blavatsky, and stuff like that, and he created this movement, very, very popular. And they were, even during the years when communists were illegal, they were underground, they were connections, and Danovists, they were saying that, you know, that they were all dressed in white. So this is, and the communists were saying these are white communists, right? Or like, but the relationship was quite interesting because also Georgy Dimitrov had a relationship. They lived in the same house. Georgy Dimitrov, through the Protestant connection, he had connections with Danov, yes. And it was actually Georgy Dimitrov who signed an order that the grave of Danov died in 45, right after the communist takeover. And the Danov's followers petitioned personally Georgy Dimitrov to grant the permission for the grave. And afterwards there was, you know, to this day, the grave of Danov is preserved. Zhivkova had very close connections with the White Brotherhood. I have an entire chapter on the White Brotherhood that I actually trace the entire 20th century history of the White Brotherhood to show that that it not only survived communism, but it flourished, and especially during late communism. By the way, the White Brotherhood is the only occult mystical movement in Eastern Europe that was officially recognized as a religious teaching, and it was in constant correspondence with the Committee for Faiths and Denominations. So they had petitions, they wanted stuff, they wanted to, and there was a huge battle at some point, because this is a very, it's prime time real estate that the White Brotherhood had their commune. Originally it was sort of undeveloped, but they developed it, and afterwards they wanted to build their Japanese embassy, like several stuff they wanted to build, and the Danovists were successful because they petitioned, they were in very good relationship, they were tolerated by the state. Zhivkov himself explained that these are white communists to Brezhnev, and saying that they were not at all dangerous, that the partisans were hiding in their village. They were also, of course, feeding people, because those were very hungry years, and they had like a communal kitchen for everyone and stuff like that. And oh yeah, because this is at the turn of the century, you know, you have this, let's say, synergies between occultism and socialism from Victorian London to post-Ottoman Bulgaria. In Greece, you have Platon Dracoulis, for example, that you have, again, occultism with Marxism. So it was, but what I want to show is that because communists distance themselves from that, and they say, well, we have nothing to do with it, and if they attack something, they say this is occultism, this is mysticism, this is all this kind of stuff. But these affinities existed at the turn of the century, and what I want to say is this is not just the malaise of that time period, but it actually continued, and it reached a peak during late socialism, ironically. The methodology about the reception, yes, I've conducted interviews with, what is it, like 40 people or something like that. The reception is tricky because the reception has changed. Whereas people before criticized her initiatives mostly because they were very costly, because they were extravagant, and because obviously she could do it because she was a Zhivkova, and people were. Now a lot of people who are interviewed who were at the time opposed, they have changed their, let's say, they say that, well, now in retrospect, I realized that this was an unprecedented history, especially what happened during the transition. Lots of people amended, including the ones who were highly critical of her at the time. And so, yeah, I interviewed the people from her close circle, most of them for the dissertation. Several of them passed away subsequently, but of course they would tell you the narrative that because they've been part of it. So in those interviews, they try to distance, to sort of separate her policies, her cultural policies from the occult. They don't mention it, with the exception of Bogumil Rainov, who wrote a book actually about it even. So yeah, I mean, interviews and diaries, like interviews are crucial because lots of it were rumors. For example, in the Bulgarian, let's say the old guard, they criticized her. Of course, they couldn't do it openly because of her high rank, but they would say that this is nationalism, that this is like anti-Soviet initiatives and anti-communist even. So yeah, what was also the repercussions and reception, the Soviet Union, on the comparative, so that's the idea, is to compare all these different, let's say, now for this book, I just do Eastern Europe because I cannot do with emphasis on Bulgaria, but doing Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia. But the idea is for the future project to do this rational and irrational in socialism, yes. And like I said, for example, I've been doing research on Greece. I mean, in Greece, it's also quite interesting that you have that, and you have it in the West. So it would be good to open it up in a comparative framework to see these different moments of when you have.
I was part for the whole project on new religiosities in Turkey.
Oh.
That was a French-German project. And it was an interesting thing that in Turkey we don't have theosophy. It's totally different. That was very Germans were very stacked from that because they are used to have philosophy as the main ritual of But in Turkey you have a big range of movements, but you don't have philosophy. For instance, in Bulgaria, where it seems that philosophy is present from very early. So
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because they do have Islam and mysticism and yeah. But I didn't know about theosophy. That yeah. Was it maybe it wasn't introduced or it wasn't? No. What I mean is theosophy wasn't introduced in Turkey, wasn't translated, or yeah. Yeah. No, that's great. I will look into it and into the project because that sounds great. Is the project in what language? Oh, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that would be great. Chat later.
Just a final one, out of curiosity, you talked about the 100 years of Bulgarian state.
13.
Yeah, 13, I don't know. I mean, I remember that because it was Bulgarian bookshop in Greek, in Athens.
Everywhere.
And they used in the 80s to have books that were, not to promote them, big editions of. So I was wondering, did Zivkova had also a kind of pet plan, or especially on Bulgarian history or any kind of thracology or any kind of historical context where she would find an inspiration or she would attach to her program? Did she have any kind of specific historical
No, because not necessarily, because for her conception of time, it's like the past and the present and the future are simultaneous and everything occurs at the same time. But actually, I mean, she's a historian by education and she's a professionally trained historian. But the idea for her was that you show the historical context, but you don't emphasize, including for the 13th century of Bulgaria, she was very clear on the fact that this shouldn't be from nationalistic point of view. This should be used to sort of to be very careful, not to produce any grandiose statements about the role of Bulgaria, but just to show the idea that Bulgaria is a bridge between East and West, and to show that, whether it is going to be during the Renaissance, like she didn't have a particular favorite time period. She was all over the place, like from the Renaissance to Bogumils. That was anything that had to do with philosophy, with religiosity, with spirituality. Yes, absolutely, yes. Yeah. Thracology, she was very linked to that because the founder of that Institute of Thracology was actually her professor at Sofia University, Alexander Fall, who was very charismatic figure, also part of the pre-war elite, who, Zhivkova was totally like, she was his student, and she, like many other female students of the time, were in love with him. That was a common occurrence because he is indeed a very charismatic person. But yet trachology, Orpheism, like that was obviously very heavily encouraged, sponsored, this entire discipline, and propagated relentlessly everywhere. I mean, symposiums, conferences, like Alexander Fall really carried that trachology everywhere.
we hope to see you again soon and develop a cooperation with the institute.